Eleanor Whitfield burned her father's letter the morning she was supposed to thank him for it. The paper curled and blackened in the fireplace. Every word that called her sacrifice necessary, every line that dressed her ruin up as duty, gone to ash before breakfast. She was 24 years old. She was being handed to a stranger to settle a debt she never made. And she had stopped crying about it 3 days ago. If you're just finding this channel, subscribe and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia, summer 1816. The Whitfield name had once meant something in Albemarle County. It meant the two-story house on the eastern ridge with the white fence her mother had painted herself. It meant the Whitfield pew at First Presbyterian, third row from the front, where the family sat every Sunday with the particular stillness of people who believed they had earned their place. It meant her father's handshake, firm, confident, the handshake of a man who had land and credit and the goodwill of his neighbors. By the summer of 1816, it meant debt, $47,000 of it, accumulated across 6 years of bad investments, a failed shipping venture in Norfolk, and a tobacco harvest that the late frost had killed down to the roots. $47,000 that the Virginia Commonwealth Bank had allowed to sit, politely, with interest, until the morning they sent a letter informing Thomas Whitfield that they were done being polite. Eleanor had read the letter herself. Her father had left it on the breakfast table, face down, as though the paper itself were ashamed. She had turned it over, read every line twice, and then sat very still for a long moment while the morning light moved across the kitchen floor, and her father stood at the window with his back to her, unable to turn around. "How long?" she had asked. 90 days, he said. "They want the property or the payment. And the payment is not something we have." Eleanor had folded the letter carefully along its original crease and set it back on the table. "Then we sell," she said. "We can't." Her father's voice cracked on the second word. "The estate is entailed. It goes to your cousin James upon my death. I cannot sell what isn't fully mine to sell. The bank knows this. They've been advised." "Then we borrow." "From whom?" He finally turned. Thomas Whitfield was 56 years old and looked, in that moment, considerably older. "Every man I could ask has already heard. Word travels fast in this county, Eleanor. Nobody lends money to a sinking ship." She had looked at him for a long moment. She had thought about her mother, who had died 4 years ago, and had spent the last decade of her life quietly managing what Thomas Whitfield quietly mismanaged, and who had never once said so aloud, because that was not what a wife did in 1812. She had thought about her younger sister, Clara, 16 years old, and currently upstairs braiding ribbons into her hair and believing, with the gorgeous confidence of someone who had not yet read the letter, that everything was fine. And she had thought about the Whitfield pew, third row from the front. "There is one option," her father said, and his voice dropped in a way that told her he had been rehearsing this sentence for some time. "Nathaniel Harrington has expressed an interest." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Eleanor kept her face still. She had heard the name, Nathaniel Harrington, the same way every young woman in Albemarle County had heard it, in lowered voices, with raised eyebrows, in the particular tone people used when they wanted to convey that a subject was both fascinating and dangerous. He was 34 years old. He owned 11,000 acres of land in 3 counties, a house that people called a mansion and others called a fortress, depending on their feelings about the man who lived in it. He had inherited everything from a brother who died of fever 6 years ago, and in 6 years he had spoken publicly at exactly 4 events and attended exactly none of the social functions to which he had been invited. People said he was cold. People said he was ruthless. People said he had ruined a business partner in Richmond so thoroughly that the man had left Virginia entirely and started over in Ohio. Women who had been introduced to him at the rare occasions where he could not avoid introduction reported that he did not smile, that he answered questions in complete sentences but offered nothing beyond what was asked, that his eyes were a particular shade of gray that made people feel, somehow, as though they were being assessed rather than seen. "He is interested," Eleanor said carefully. "In what exactly?" Her father looked at the floor. That told her everything. She did not cry. She had given herself 3 days for that. 3 days from the moment she understood what her father was suggesting to the morning she burned his letter. And now the crying was done, and what remained was something cooler and more functional. Not acceptance, exactly. More like the particular clarity that comes when you have looked at every possible door and found them locked one by one, and the only door left is the one you never wanted to open. She wrote to Nathaniel Harrington herself. Her father had assumed he would handle the correspondence. He was wrong. If Eleanor Whitfield was going to be discussed as a potential solution to someone's problems, she was going to be the one doing the discussing. She wrote a single page in her clearest hand, stated the family's situation without embellishment or apology, identified what she understood him to be proposing, and asked directly whether her understanding was correct. She asked him to respond in kind, plainly, without softening, because she was not interested in being managed. She sent it with the Tuesday post. His response arrived Thursday. It was 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was precise and slightly angular, the kind of script that suggested a man who had been taught by someone exacting and had never shed the habit. He confirmed her understanding. He stated the terms he was prepared to offer: payment of the full debt, the Whitfield estate to remain in the family's name, with Eleanor holding a life interest, a household allowance of $300 per annum for her personal use, independent of any household accounts she might manage. He stated that he expected nothing from the arrangement beyond her presence as his wife in the legal sense, and that the management of any shared property would be a matter for discussion between them as equals. The last paragraph read, "I am aware of what people say about me, Miss Whitfield. I will not ask you to disbelieve them on faith. I will ask only that you observe me directly and form your own opinion. That is all I have ever asked of anyone, and it is all I ask of you." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and sat for a long moment with it in her hands. She was not naive. She understood that a man could write a reasonable letter and be an unreasonable man. She understood that civility on paper was not the same as decency in a household. She understood that the history of women entering into arrangements exactly like this one was not, in the aggregate, a history of women who had ended up better off. But she also understood that her father's plan, if left to her father, would involve approximately 3 months of polite negotiation, during which the bank would take the estate, and that whatever arrangement emerged from that process would contain nothing like an independent allowance and nothing like the word equals. She wrote back the same afternoon. She said she would meet him. He came to the house on a Tuesday, which was not the day she expected. She had assumed he would send word first. He did not. He arrived at 10 in the morning on a horse that was plainly expensive and ridden plainly hard, dismounted without ceremony in the front yard, and knocked on the door as though he had been expected. Eleanor opened it herself because the housemaid had gone to market, and her father was in his study, pretending to review documents, and her sister Clara was somewhere upstairs being 16. Nathaniel Harrington was taller than she expected. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he looked exactly like a man who had ridden hard for several hours and had not stopped to consider what impression this might make. His coat was dusty, there was dried mud on his left boot, and he had clearly not looked in a mirror recently. He was not handsome in the way that men in romantic novels were handsome. He was handsome in the way that weather-worn things were handsome, with a face that had clearly lived outdoors in it, sharp-featured and slightly sun-darkened, and eyes that were, yes, a particular shade of gray. He looked at her with those eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Harrington," she said, "you're early. We didn't set a day." "No," she agreed, "we did not. Come in." He stepped inside and removed his hat, a plain dark hat, nothing decorative, and held it in his left hand in a way that suggested he was not sure where to put it. Eleanor's house, she realized, was not large enough to have a proper receiving room. The front hall led directly to the sitting room, which led to the dining room, which was where her father had been eating his feelings for 6 months, and which therefore looked somewhat reduced. She led him to the sitting room and gestured at a chair. He sat. She sat across from him. I don't serve tea at 10 in the morning, she said, which was not entirely true, but felt important to establish. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. That's all right, he said. I didn't come for tea. No, she said. You came to look at me. A pause. Yes, he said, and she respected him slightly for not pretending otherwise. And you came to look at me. I did. They looked at each other. She noticed that he did not look at her the way men usually looked at women in these circumstances, assessing, calculating, measuring her against some internal standard of decorativeness. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a piece of land he was considering purchasing, which sounds unflattering but was not, because she had seen men look at land, and they looked at it with genuine, focused attention, trying to understand what it actually was, rather than what they wanted it to be. I want to ask you something directly, she said. Go ahead. What do you actually want from this arrangement? He was quiet for a moment. A wife who will not make my life more difficult than it already is, he said. Someone who can manage a household intelligently. Someone who will attend the functions I am required to attend and conduct herself with dignity. Someone who will not be miserable every day and make everyone around her miserable in the process. That's a list of practical requirements, she said. Yes. You don't want... She stopped, chose her words. You don't require affection. I didn't say that. He looked at her steadily. I said I don't require performance. Whatever develops between two people living in the same house, honestly, I'm willing to let develop. What I don't want is a woman who will perform happiness she doesn't feel and then hate me for the performance. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. My father thinks this conversation should be happening between you and him, she said. Your father is not the one who wrote to me. No, she said. He is not. Another of those silences. Outside, a horse, his horse presumably, made a sound in the yard. I have one condition, Eleanor said. State it. If I am miserable, I will tell you so directly. I will not pretend. And if the arrangement becomes something neither of us can tolerate, we discuss it as adults rather than... She paused. Rather than whatever the alternative looks like. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. You agreed very quickly. It's a reasonable condition. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, hat still in his hand. Miss Whitfield, I'm not interested in owning you. I'm not interested in a woman who does what she's told and stays in her rooms, and thanks me for the privilege of being fed. That's not a wife. That's furniture. People say very different things about you, she said. People say a great many things about me. They say you ruined a man in Richmond. His jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. James Caldwell was defrauding his clients. 3 families lost their savings. I took him to court. He lost. A pause. That is ruining a man, I suppose, if you're the man being held accountable. Eleanor considered this. They say you don't know kindness, she said. I know exactly what kindness is, he said quietly. I choose not to perform it for an audience. They were married 6 weeks later in the parlor of the Whitfield house, with her father and sister and the Harrington family attorney as witnesses. On a Thursday afternoon, when the summer heat had settled over Albemarle County, like a physical weight, and every window in the house was standing open. Clara cried. Not from grief exactly, but from the overwhelming pressure of the occasion and the vague feeling that something irrevocable was happening, which was correct. Thomas Whitfield shook Nathaniel's hand afterward, with the relieved solemnity of a man who had just passed a responsibility off his shoulders and was trying not to show how light he felt. Nathaniel shook his hand, turned to Eleanor, and offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of her father's house and into the heat of the afternoon, and she did not look back, because she had made her decision 3 weeks ago, and she had no intention of spending her energy on second-guessing it. The carriage that was waiting was plain and well-maintained. Nothing extravagant. She noticed that. She noticed, too, that when they reached the carriage and he helped her in, he let go of her hand the instant she was settled, stepped back, and knocked twice on the side to tell the driver to go. He had touched her hand for exactly as long as was necessary to be helpful, and not 1 second longer. She sat in the carriage and thought about that the whole long drive to Harrington Manor.
Sure.
The house was large. She had known it would be large. People had told her it was large. But knowing a thing and seeing it are different experiences, and when the carriage came around the last bend in the drive and Harrington Manor came into view, Eleanor sat very still and allowed herself one private, honest moment of being overwhelmed. It was not a fortress, not exactly. But she could see why someone might call it that. It was a federal-style house, 3 stories, built from pale Virginia brick that had gone a little gray with age, with a wide front portico and large windows that looked out over the lawn like eyes. It was the kind of house that had opinions about itself. Nathaniel was watching her. She did not look at him, but she could feel it. "It's larger than I was told," she said. "Most things are," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No." She turned to look at him. "It's a house. Houses are manageable." Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but something close to one. Something approving. "The housekeeper is Mrs. Baines," he said. "She's been here 30 years. She is occasionally short with people she doesn't respect. She will not be short with you." "How do you know?" "Because I told her you were not to be managed," he said. "And because she is a woman of considerable intelligence who will recognize, within 10 minutes of meeting you, that you cannot be." Eleanor looked at him. "You spoke to your housekeeper about me before we arrived." "I prepared the household for a new mistress," he said, as though this were simply the obvious thing to do. "The staff needed to know your preferences would take precedence over mine in household matters. I told them so this morning." She was quiet for a moment. "This morning," she repeated. "You rode here this morning, and then rode to my father's house, and were married, and now we're here." "Yes." "That's a great deal of riding." "I'm accustomed to it." The carriage stopped. A groom appeared from somewhere and took the horses. A woman who could only be Mrs. Baines appeared on the front steps. Stout, 60-something, with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had managed difficult situations for 3 decades and would manage several more before she was done. Mrs. Baines looked at Eleanor the way Eleanor had looked at Nathaniel's letter. Carefully, directly, without performance. "Mrs. Harrington," she said. The name hit Eleanor in a strange place. Not unpleasantly, just unexpectedly, like stepping on a stair in the dark that was not where you expected it to be. "Mrs. Baines," she said. "I understand you've been managing this house for 30 years. "I have." "Then you know it far better than I do. I'd like to begin with a tour if you're available, and then I'd like to sit with the household accounts." A pause. Mrs. Baines looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. Mrs. Baines looked back at Eleanor, and something settled in her expression. Something that was not quite warmth yet, but was the precondition for warmth. "Of course, Mrs. Harrington," she said. "Come in." The accounts were a revelation, not in a good way. Eleanor sat in the estate office that evening, a room clearly designed for Nathaniel, but clearly not used by him for administration, because the desk was covered in what appeared to be land survey maps, and the actual account ledgers were in a cabinet in the corner that had apparently not been opened in some time. And she spent 2 hours going through 5 years of financial records. The estate was profitable. Substantially profitable, actually. The land Nathaniel owned was well managed, the crops diverse, the tenancies structured in a way that suggested someone had thought carefully about long-term stability rather than short-term extraction. The income was solid. The outgoing was chaotic, not corrupt, not mismanaged in the sense of money going somewhere it shouldn't, just disorganized. Payments made without system. Charitable disbursements that appeared to have been made whenever the mood struck, to individuals and families that were not formally identified in any ledger. A hospital in Lexington that received irregular payments. A school for freedmen's children outside of Louisville that appeared 3 times under different line descriptions, as though whoever recorded it had been uncertain whether to acknowledge it at all. Eleanor sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began making notes. She was still making them when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway 2 hours later. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the open ledger, the stacked papers, the notations she had made in her own hand in the margins. "I would have shown you those," he said. "I found them," she said. "You're supporting a school." A pause. "Yes." "For freedmen's children." "Yes." "In Kentucky." "Yes." Under 3 different line items, so it wouldn't be immediately obvious in the accounts. The silence stretched. "Who were you hiding it from?" she asked. Howe was quiet for a moment. He came into the room and stood near the desk, not sitting, looking at the ledger rather than at her. "The estate has investors," he said finally. "Silent partners who contributed capital to the early expansion. Men of a particular—" He paused. "Persuasion. Who would have found certain expenditures disagreeable?" "And the hospital in Lexington? A man who works on one of my farms broke his leg last March. I paid his treatment costs and those of his family while he recovered." Nathaniel's jaw worked briefly. "His wife had a child due in June. I paid that too." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "You're going to reorganize the accounts," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm going to reorganize the accounts," she confirmed. "But I need to understand what you're actually doing before I can create a system that protects it. The school, the hospital, the individual payments to families. Are there others I haven't found yet?" Another silence. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Yes," he said. "There are others." "Tell me," she said. He told her. It took the better part of an hour. 14 families with irregular support. A widow in Madison County. A freedman who had purchased his own freedom and was trying to establish a small farm whom Nathaniel had been quietly financing without formal documentation, because formal documentation created legal exposure he could not afford. The school, which he had been funding for 3 years, and which had 26 students currently enrolled. 2 young men, one black, one white, both the sons of men who had worked Harrington land, whom he was paying to attend an academy in Lexington. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her notes. "You've been doing all of this," she said, "while maintaining the public reputation of a man who doesn't care about anyone." "The reputation is useful," he said. "People leave me alone. People are afraid of you." "Yes. And you prefer that." "I prefer," he said carefully, "not to spend my time at social functions explaining myself to people who have already decided what I am." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had expected when her father said the name Nathaniel Harrington. The cold man. The heartless man. The man who ruined people. She thought about 14 families. A school. 26 children. "The accounts," she said, "can be reorganized in a way that protects all of this and also makes the estate's finances legible. I'll need a week." He looked at her. "A week," he said. "I work quickly when I have complete information," she said. "Which I now do, assuming you've told me everything." A pause. "I've told you everything," he said. "Good." She capped her pen and began stacking the papers in order. "Then I'll begin in the morning." She looked up and found him still watching her with that gray, assessing gaze. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "you've spent 6 years letting people believe the worst of you while quietly doing the opposite. That is either the most selfless thing I've encountered or the most exhausting." "Both," he said quietly, after a moment. "Yes," she said. "I imagine so." She gathered her papers, stood, and moved toward the door. "Mrs. Harrington," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For not—" He paused. "For not making me explain why." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for doing what is right," she said. "Least of all me." She walked out into the hall and up the stairs to her rooms. And Nathaniel Harrington sat alone in the estate office for a long time afterward, looking at the empty chair across from him, and did not, for the first time in years, feel entirely alone in his own house. She started with the numbers because numbers didn't lie. People lied. Circumstances lied. Reputations built on rumor and social malice lied constantly and enthusiastically. But a column of figures either balanced or it didn't, and Eleanor had always found something deeply steadying in that fact. She spent the first 3 days at Harrington Manor in the estate office, rising before 6, working until the light failed, eating what Mrs. Baines brought her without looking up from the ledgers. She built a new system from scratch, a clean, logical structure that separated operating income from charitable disbursements, that documented every irregular payment with enough paper trail to be defensible, but not enough detail to be dangerous. The school in Louisville became a line item under educational improvements to tenant properties. The widow in Madison County became part of a broader account labeled Community Relief Fund. The freedman financing his farm. That one was harder, and she thought about it for a full afternoon before finding a structure that protected both Nathaniel's legal position and the man's dignity. On the fourth morning, Nathaniel appeared in the doorway of the office and looked at the organized stacks of paper on the desk and the new ledger she had started, and he said, "You said a week." "I said I work quickly when I have complete information," Eleanor said, without looking up. A pause. "Is it done?" "The structural reorganization is done. I need your signature on 6 documents and your confirmation on 2 disbursements I wasn't certain how to categorize." He came in and sat across from her, and she walked him through it. Clean, systematic, no excess explanation. He read each document carefully, which she respected. He asked 2 questions, both of them good ones. He signed where she indicated. When they finished, he sat back and looked at the new ledger. "This is better," he said. "It's also defensible," she said. "If your silent partners ever demand an audit, and men like that generally do, eventually, there's nothing here they can object to. The charitable work is documented as property management and community investment, both of which it genuinely is." He was quiet for a moment. "You protected it," he said. "I organized it," she said. "There's a difference. The work itself didn't need protecting. It just needed to stop looking like something to hide." Nathaniel looked at her across the desk, and she had the sense, not for the first time, that he was filing something away, cataloging her, the way she cataloged numbers, trying to understand what she actually was. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened," he said honestly. Eleanor set down her pen. "Mr. Harrington, I have been managing my father's household accounts since I was 17 years old because my father could not be trusted with them. I have been the practical center of a family that preferred not to acknowledge it needed one. I have been proposed as a financial solution by a man who raised me." She paused. "Frightened of what, exactly?" "You've given me a household to run, an office to work in, and more independence than I had under my father's roof. What precisely should I be frightened of?" I was quiet for a long time. "Nothing," he said finally, "as it turns out." The household found its rhythm, the way rivers found their course, not all at once, but steadily, cutting the path that made the most sense. Eleanor met with Mrs. Baines every morning after breakfast, which Mrs. Baines had initially approached with the cautious professionalism of a woman who had run a house for 30 years and was prepared to tolerate interference graciously, but not welcome it. That lasted approximately 4 days, until Eleanor walked into the kitchen and found Mrs. Baines in a standoff with a supplier from Charlottesville, who was attempting to charge 30% above the agreed contract price because the last mistress of Harrington Manor, which was to say, no one, had not been around to object. Eleanor had read the original contract because she had read all the contracts. She looked at the supplier. She looked at the contract. She looked back at the supplier. "You're welcome to renegotiate the terms," she said pleasantly. "But I should mention that I've already spoken with 2 other suppliers this week who are willing to honor the original rate, and I've found both of them quite interested in a long-term arrangement with this estate. So if you'd like to discuss your pricing, we can discuss it. Otherwise, I'll thank you for your time and wish you good morning." The supplier honored the original rate. Mrs. Baines, watching from the doorway, said nothing. But something changed in her face that afternoon, and the following morning she brought Eleanor her coffee exactly the way she preferred it. Strong, with no sugar, without being asked. The staff, Eleanor came to understand, were not loyal to Nathaniel out of fear. They were loyal because he paid fairly, treated them with basic decency, and did not make their lives difficult for sport. These were, she was learning, apparently considered unusual qualities in an employer, which told her more about the standards of 1816 Virginia than she particularly wanted to know. But loyalty to an employer was a practical thing. What the staff felt for Nathaniel had an edge of something more personal than that, and it took Eleanor another 2 weeks to understand what it was. She found out from a young housemaid named Patience, 17 years old, quick with her work, and possessed of the particular quality of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing, who had been at Harrington Manor since she was 14. "Mr. Harrington paid for my mother's doctor," Patience said one morning, while Eleanor was reviewing the household inventory and Patience was returning linens to the cabinet. She said it the way someone says a thing they've been carrying and have decided to set down. "When she was sick 2 winters ago, she couldn't work and—" She stopped. "He just arranged it. I didn't find out until after. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell anybody." Eleanor kept her eyes on the inventory list. "He does that," she said. "Most men don't," Patience said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "They don't." After Patience left, Eleanor sat for a moment with the inventory list in her hands, thinking about a man who paid a housemaid's mother's medical bills and then did not mention it, who financed a freedman's farm and kept it off the books, who ran the numbers under different line items so that men who would have objected could not find the thing to object to. The world called him heartless. Eleanor was beginning to think the world had confused silence for emptiness. They had dinner together, which had not been the plan. The plan, insofar as there had been one, was separate arrangements. He was a busy man. She was establishing herself in a new household. They would intersect at necessary functions and otherwise manage their own time. That had seemed sensible when they discussed it before the wedding. What actually happened was that Eleanor finished her work in the office on the 5th day and went to the dining room because she was hungry, and the dining room was where food happened, and Nathaniel was already there, eating alone at the long table with a survey map open beside his plate. And they had both looked at each other with the slightly awkward recognition of two people whose practical plan had not accounted for the fact that they lived in the same house. "I can eat in the office," Eleanor said. "You don't have to," he said. She sat down. Mrs. Baines, who Eleanor was fairly certain had arranged this situation deliberately, appeared with a second setting and said nothing. They ate in silence for a while, which was not, Eleanor discovered, an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were both accustomed to eating alone and had not yet developed the reflexive need to fill quiet space with words that didn't mean anything. "The Henderson farm," Nathaniel said eventually, looking at his survey map. "What about it?" He turned the map so she could see it. "The eastern fence line. There's a dispute with the neighboring property, Caldwell land, now Caldwell's son, who inherited, about where the actual boundary sits. I have the original survey from 1803, but the son is claiming his father had a verbal agreement that moved the line 20 feet east." "Verbal agreements," Eleanor said. "Yes." "In 1803. Yes. From a man who is now dead." "Correct. That is not going to hold up in any legal proceeding." "I know." He looked at the map. "But the Henderson family has farmed that boundary for 11 years, and they're going to lose the use of it while the dispute proceeds, which will cost them the better part of their crop yield this season." Eleanor looked at the map. Then she said, "Is there anything on the Caldwell side of the disputed land that he actually needs? Something he'd be willing to trade if there were something he wanted more?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "There's a water access point on the Harrington side," he said slowly. "The Caldwells have been routing their cattle the long way around for years because of a drainage issue on their eastern edge. Offer him the water access in exchange for letting the Hendersons continue working their established boundary pending a formal survey," Eleanor said. "He gets something he's wanted for years. You avoid a legal proceeding. The Hendersons keep their crop. Everyone is better off than they would be after 6 months in court." Nathaniel looked at her. "I hadn't thought of it that way," he said. "You were thinking about who was right," she said. "I was thinking about what everyone actually wants." I was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to be very useful." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I mean that as a compliment, he said. I know you do, she said. It still sounds like something you'd say about a particularly efficient piece of equipment. Something genuine crossed his face then. Something startled and almost abashed. And Eleanor realized with a small jolt that he was not used to being told when he'd said the wrong thing. That people around him either didn't notice or didn't feel they could. I apologize, he said. That was, yes, that was poorly said. Don't apologize, she said. Just notice it. Notice it, he repeated. When you say something that treats a person like a function rather than a person, she said, just notice it. That's all I ask. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes. Agreed, he said. They finished dinner, and she went back to her rooms, and he went back to his survey maps, and Eleanor lay in bed for a while afterward, and thought about the expression on his face when she'd called him out, that startled, almost young look, and thought that whoever had been in this man's life before, they had not told him the truth very often, which was, she thought, its own kind of cruelty. The first crisis came 3 weeks in, and it came from Charlottesville. A man named Aldous Webb arrived at Harrington Manor on a Wednesday morning without an invitation, riding with 2 associates and the particular confidence of someone who expected doors to open for him because they always had. He was 50-something, heavy-set, with the prosperous look of a man who had made money in ways that were legal but had never been required to be decent about it. He was one of Nathaniel's silent investors. He had, apparently, been making inquiries. Eleanor was in the garden when the riders came up the drive. Not tending the garden, she didn't tend gardens, but walking through it because it was the only part of the estate she hadn't yet catalogued and she wanted to understand what they had. She came back inside through the side entrance just as Mrs. Baines was informing the visitors that Mr. Harrington was not currently receiving calls. And Aldous Webb was explaining, in the tone of a man who felt that facts about his schedule were more relevant than the housekeeper's information, that he would wait. Eleanor walked into the front hall. Webb looked at her with the particular look of a man who has seen a woman appear in an unfamiliar house and has immediately filed her under irrelevant. Mrs. Harrington, Mrs. Baines, with emphasis. Webb reassessed. Not with respect, with calculation. You must be the Whitfield girl, he said. I must be Mrs. Harrington, Eleanor said. My husband isn't currently receiving visitors. If you'd like to send ahead and schedule a meeting. This is a business matter, Webb said. I'm a significant investor in these operations, and I have questions about certain account irregularities that came to my attention. A cold finger moved up Eleanor's spine. She kept her face perfectly still. Account irregularities, she said. Someone's been looking at the books, Webb said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, a summary of accounts, she could see, partially visible at the edge of the fold. There are disbursements that don't add up, educational improvements, community relief. I've been doing business long enough to know what that kind of language means. Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at Aldous Webb. She thought about 26 children in a school in Louisville, and then she did something she had not planned to do, because she had not known she would need to do it. Because 3 weeks ago she had built a financial system specifically designed to prevent exactly this conversation, which meant that someone had been looking at the old records, the records from before she reorganized them. Mr. Webb, she said pleasantly, would you like to sit down? He blinked. He had expected, she thought, either argument or retreat. He had not expected an invitation. I've been managing the Harrington estate accounts since our marriage, she said, gesturing toward the sitting room. If you have questions about specific line items, I'm happy to address them. The accounts are quite clear, I believe, though I'm aware the previous system was. She paused, choosing her word carefully. Informal. Webb followed her into the sitting room. His associates stayed in the hall. He sat, warily, and looked at her with the revised attention of a man recalibrating. The educational improvements, she said, before he could speak, refer to the construction and maintenance of a schoolhouse on the outer tenant properties in Fayette County. Literate workers are more efficient workers, Mr. Webb. The productivity numbers on those properties bear this out. She paused. I can show you the comparative yield data if you'd like. Webb looked at her. The Community Relief Fund, she continued, addresses medical costs for workers who experience temporary incapacity. The alternative is losing trained workers to injuries they cannot afford to treat. The cost of replacement and retraining is significantly higher than the cost of basic medical support. This is, I believe, straightforward economics. Webb was very quiet. As for the informal disbursements in the older records, she said, her voice still pleasant, still conversational. Those were a bookkeeping issue from before I took over the accounts. I've corrected the system. Everything is properly documented now. You're welcome to review the current ledgers. She let that sit in the air for a moment. Or, she said, I can prepare a summary for you with the productivity and yield comparisons that I believe will demonstrate quite clearly that the management decisions in question have been financially sound. Which would you prefer? Aldous Webb looked at her for a long, assessing moment. I was not a stupid man. She had not expected him to be. But he had expected a nervous young wife who would defer or panic, and he had gotten something considerably different, and she could see him working through the recalibration in real time. A summary would be acceptable, he said finally. I'll have it ready by Friday, she said. I'll send it to your address in Charlottesville. Is that still the correct address? It is. Excellent. She stood. He stood automatically, habit and manners, and she offered her hand the way a businesswoman offers her hand, which was not a thing women did in 1816 Virginia, which was exactly why she did it. Thank you for coming out. The drive from Charlottesville is not short. He shook her hand. He looked slightly as though he wasn't sure what had happened. She walked him to the door herself. She found Nathaniel in the stables 20 minutes later. He had apparently seen Webb arrive from a distance. The property was large enough that he could have stayed out of sight for hours if he chose, and had chosen not to come in. Whether that was deliberate strategy or reluctance, she wasn't sure. Aldous Webb was here, she said. He didn't look up from the horse he was checking. I saw the riders. He had questions about the accounts. Now he looked up. He had an old summary, she said. Pre-reorganization. He thought he'd found something. The look on Nathaniel's face moved through something dark before settling back to still. What did you tell him? The truth, she said. Organized differently. The school is a productivity investment. The medical support is workforce retention. The numbers back both claims up because they're both genuinely true. Nathaniel stared at her. You handled Aldous Webb, he said. I had a conversation with him, yes. In 20 minutes. He wasn't difficult, she said. He was used to being the most prepared person in the room. He wasn't, this time. Nathaniel set down what he was holding and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between relief and something rawer than that. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it. She was fairly certain he noticed that she noticed it. It's fine, she said. I'll send him a summary Friday. He'll review it and find nothing to object to, and he'll leave it alone. Men like Webb don't push past the first line of defense if the first line is solid. They're looking for easy wins. He's been looking for something to use against me for 3 years, Nathaniel said quietly. Why? A pause. Something shifted in his face. He wanted the school, he said. Before I purchased the land it sits on. He had plans for it. A mill, I think. He lost the bid, and he's never forgiven it. Eleanor absorbed this. So this wasn't really about the accounts. It never is, he said. With Webb, it's always about the land. Then the summary will be enough, she said. Because he can't get to the land through the accounts. I've made sure of that. She turned to leave. She had a response letter to draft and a summary to prepare. Why? Nathaniel said behind her. Not a challenge. A real question. She stopped. Why what? Why does it matter to you? He said. The school. The families. Why do you? He stopped. Started again. You could have answered his questions and let the chips fall. It wouldn't have been your fault. You've been married 3 weeks. Nobody would have blamed you. Eleanor turned around and looked at him. 26 children, she said. He was quiet. You told me 26 children are currently enrolled in that school, she said. That is 26 children learning to read and write and count, in a world that would prefer they didn't, because one man with land and money and enough moral backbone to use both decided it mattered. She paused. Of course it matters. What kind of person would stand in the hall and let Aldous Webb dismantle it, because she'd only been married 3 weeks? The silence that followed was different from the other silences she'd experienced in this house. Heavier, charged with something she didn't have a name for yet. "You're not what I expected," Nathaniel said again. "You've said that," she said. "I keep being surprised," he said. "That's unusual for me." "Get used to it," she said, and walked back to the house. She heard him make a sound behind her, short, quiet, involuntary, and she realized, with a small and private satisfaction, that it was a laugh. Nathaniel Harrington, who did not smile for audiences, laughed when he was alone in a stable, and no one was supposed to be watching. She filed that away, too. The Charlottesville summary went out Friday as promised. Webb sent a brief acknowledgement the following Tuesday. No further questions. No follow-up visit. The investment relationship continued as before, which was to say that his money stayed where it was, and his opinions about how Harrington land was managed remained his own. Mrs. Baines, who had somehow learned the entire story, despite not having been present for any of it, brought Eleanor an extra slice of cake at dinner that evening and said nothing at all, which Eleanor was coming to understand was Mrs. Baines's highest form of approval. Patience, setting the table, caught Eleanor's eye and smiled the quick private smile of someone who understood that something significant had just happened and was pleased about it. Eleanor ate her cake and reviewed the week's correspondence and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was in exactly the right place, doing exactly the right work. The summer deepened, and the days settled into a shape she had not expected. She managed the household in the mornings. She managed the accounts in the afternoons. Nathaniel roaded the property every day. 11,000 acres required constant attention, and he gave it, and came back in the evenings with the particular exhausted satisfaction of a man who had done real physical work. They ate dinner together most evenings now, not by design, but by habit, and the silence between them had slowly, over the course of weeks, become a conversation. He told her about this property in the evenings, spread over survey maps and yield records, and she told him what she'd found in the accounts and what she thought they should do differently. And somewhere in that process of talking practically about practical things, she began to understand him in a way that no amount of romantic conversation would have produced. She learned that he had inherited the estate under circumstances that were still clearly painful. His brother Marcus had died suddenly at 28, leaving debts and disorder that Nathaniel had spent 6 years quietly resolving. She learned that the ruined man in Richmond, James Caldwell's predecessor, had in fact defrauded 3 families of their life savings, and that Nathaniel had gone to court not for profit, but because one of the defrauded families had worked Harrington land and come to him because they had nowhere else to go. She learned that the school in Louisville existed because a man named Thomas, a freedman who had once worked on Harrington land and who was now a teacher, had asked Nathaniel 6 years ago whether it was possible, and Nathaniel had said yes without making Thomas explain why it should be. He told her these things the way he told her everything, without decoration, without self-congratulation, as though they were simply facts about the world that she might find useful. And she told him things in return, also without decoration, because she had found that Nathaniel Harrington responded to directness the way plants responded to water. She told him about her mother and the quiet, constant work her mother had done to hold the household together. She told him about learning the accounts at 17 and discovering that the family finances were in considerably worse shape than her father had admitted, and making the decision to manage them herself without telling her father she was doing so, because telling him would have required him to feel bad about it, and her mother had taught her that some things could be fixed better quietly. She told him about the years of watching the estate decline, despite her best efforts, because the man who was supposed to be making decisions was making them badly, and the particular exhaustion of being capable and being unable to use it. Nathaniel listened to all of this with complete attention. He did not offer solutions. He did not reframe her experience in terms of his own. He simply listened, with those gray eyes and that quality of focused presence, as though what she was saying was the most important thing happening in the world at that moment. It was, she thought, the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. The second crisis was personal, and it arrived in August in the form of her father. Thomas Whitfield rode up to Harrington Manor on a Thursday with his hat in his hands and an expression that Eleanor recognized, the particular expression he wore when he needed something and was preparing to be charming about it. He had not written. He had not sent word. He had simply arrived, the way men who expected welcome tended to arrive. Eleanor saw him from the window of the estate office. She sat for a moment, her pen still in her hand. Then she capped the pen, straightened the papers on her desk, and went downstairs. She met him on the front steps rather than inviting him in. Eleanor. He spread his arms with the warmth of a man who had done nothing wrong. How beautiful you look. Marriage agrees with you. Father, she said, you should have sent word. It was an impulse, he said. I was nearby, business in Staunton, and I thought, why not? Why not see my daughter in her new home? She looked at him. He dropped his arms. There's a small matter, he said. I thought there might be, she said. He looked at the house behind her with undisguised covetous admiration, and then looked back at her with the expression of a man who was about to ask for something and frame it as a favor he was doing her. The estate is in good hands now. Yours, I mean, obviously. But the Whitfield property, Clara's dowry, you understand. It needs some attention, some investment. There are repairs. Father, she said. He stopped. Mr. Harrington paid the debt in full, she said. That was the arrangement. The Whitfield estate remains in the family's name, as agreed. Whatever investments or repairs the estate requires are the responsibility of the family whose estate it is. Thomas Whitfield's expression shifted through several stages. Eleanor, your family, and now you have access to resources. I have a household allowance, she said, which is mine, and a role managing this estate's accounts, which is not mine to redirect for personal purposes. She paused. What you're asking me to do is take money from my husband's estate for your benefit. I won't do that. You could ask him. I will not ask him, she said. The silence sat there between them, a very different silence from the ones she'd grown accustomed to in this house. Her father looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something that looked almost like genuine surprise. You've changed, he said. I've had room to be myself, she said. That's not the same as changing. She called for someone to water her father's horse and offered him tea and an hour of conversation, which he took, because he was, underneath everything, a man she had loved most of her life. She asked about Clara, who was well. She asked about the estate and listened to what needed doing, and in her mind she was calculating, not how to take money from Nathaniel for it, but how to advise her father on what could be deferred, what could be managed with existing resources, what he could do himself if he would only apply himself to it. She could not give him money, but she could give him a plan. She spent 40 minutes laying one out, while her father looked at her with the increasingly bewildered expression of a man realizing that his daughter had become something he did not entirely recognize. Not with displeasure exactly, with the slightly dazed respect that a person can develop for something they underestimated. When he left, Nathaniel was standing in the hall. She hadn't heard him come in. Your father, he said. Yes. He needed something. He always does. She paused. I handled it. He looked at her steadily. Did you give him anything? A budget plan for the Whitfield estate, she said, and some very clear information about what the arrangement between our families does and does not include. Something passed through Nathaniel's face that she was beginning to recognize. That quiet, particular something that appeared when she did a thing he had not expected. You protected the estate, he said. I protected our arrangement, she said, which is not the same thing. The estate can defend itself. The arrangement, the understanding between us, that's worth protecting. He was very still. Eleanor, he said. Don't, she said, because she could hear something in his voice that she wasn't ready for yet. Something that, if she let it be said aloud in this hallway on a Thursday afternoon in August, would change the precise, careful balance of what they were building. She wasn't ready for it to change. Not yet. Later, she said quietly. Not yet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he had genuinely heard something. Later, he agreed. She walked past him toward the stairs. Her heart was going somewhat faster than usual. She did not let him see that. Later turned out to be September. It came the way most important things came in that house. Not announced, not planned, but arriving with the quiet inevitability of something that had been building for long enough that it could no longer be contained by ordinary Tuesday evenings and practical conversations over survey maps. The harvest had started, which meant Nathaniel was on the land before dawn and back after dark, and the estate office was Eleanor's entirely from morning until night. She had expanded her work by then, beyond the household accounts, beyond the charitable documentation, into a full analysis of the estate's long-term financial position that she had not been asked to produce, but that she had concluded was necessary. 11,000 acres required more than ledger maintenance. It required strategy, and strategy required understanding where the vulnerabilities were before someone else found them first. She found one on a Tuesday in early September that made her sit very still for a long time with her pen in the air. It was in the original land deed. The Harrington land, all 11,000 acres of it, had been held under a title structure that made sense in 1798, when Nathaniel's father drew it up, but which contained a provision that had become significantly less comfortable in the intervening 18 years. A reversionary clause. If the direct male line of the Harrington family failed, if Nathaniel died without a male heir, a substantial portion of the eastern landholdings, nearly 3,000 acres, including the tenant farms, where most of the families he supported lived, would revert to a trust administered by a board of 3 men. 2 of those 3 men were dead. The third was Aldous Webb. Eleanor set her pen down very carefully on the desk. She read the clause again. Then she read it a third time, because sometimes documents revealed different things on the third reading, and this one did not. She was still sitting there when she heard Nathaniel's boots on the front steps. She heard Mrs. Baines say something in the hall. She heard him come down the corridor. He stopped in the doorway. I was tired. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. And dirty from a day on the land. And he looked at her face, and something in his own face shifted immediately. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. She turned the deed toward him on the desk and pointed to the clause. He came in. He read it. She watched his face go through something. Recognition, she thought, not surprise. Not quite. "You knew," she said. "I knew there was a clause," he said. "I didn't know Webb was still the administrator." "Did you know he was one of the 3? "Yes." He straightened, looked at the wall rather than at her. "When I took over from Marcus, there were a great many things to address at once. The clause was one I intended to resolve through renegotiation. Then Webb became an investor, and the dynamic changed, and it became complicated." "How long ago was that?" 4 years. She looked at him. 4 years, she said. "Eleanor, you have been financially exposed to a man who wants your land for 4 years, she said, and you did not address it. I told you, it became complicated. It became uncomfortable, she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something in it that she couldn't entirely suppress. Those are different things. Complicated means there's no solution. Uncomfortable means you didn't want to have the conversation." He was silent. "Which families live on the eastern land?" she said. He named them. She counted. 14 families. 7 of them were on the list he had given her in this same office on her first night here. The families he quietly supported, whose names appeared in the informal ledgers under charitable disbursements. "If Webb gets those 3,000 acres, she said. "He won't keep the tenancies," Nathaniel said quietly. "No," she said. "He won't." The silence in the room had weight. "What do we do?" she said. He looked at her, at the "we" in that sentence, and something moved across his face that was not comfortable to watch, because it was too open, too much. There are options, he said, pulling himself back to the practical. The clause can be challenged on grounds of the trust structure. Two of the three administrators are deceased, and the trust has not been formally reconstituted. That's a legal argument. It would take time. How much time? A year, maybe two. And in the meantime, Webb knows about the clause. He's always known. Then he knows he has leverage. She picked up her pen. Who is your attorney? Robert Mercer, Lexington. Write to him tonight, she said. I want to know the precise legal status of the trust given the two deceased administrators. If the trust is technically insolvent or improperly constituted, the clause may be unenforceable regardless of its text. She paused. And I want to know if there are other options. Other options, he repeated. She met his eyes. The clause specifies failure of the direct mail line, she said. That is one kind of option. There are others. But let's hear from Mercer first. The thing she'd said hung in the air between them. Not quite said between the lines. And Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she could not categorize. Eleanor, he said. Write to Mercer tonight, she said. I'm going to dinner. She walked out. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart was not. Mercer's response arrived in 11 days, which was faster than she'd expected, which told her Nathaniel had communicated the urgency effectively. The news was mixed. The trust was technically still constituted. The founding documents allowed for vacant administrator positions to go unfilled without invalidating the structure, which had been a deliberate provision designed for exactly this kind of situation. The clause was enforceable. However, Mercer identified two avenues worth pursuing. The first was a legal challenge on grounds of changed circumstances. Virginia property law had evolved since 1798, and there were arguments to be made. The second was a negotiated buyout of the reversionary interest, which would require Webb's agreement and would likely be expensive. There was a third avenue, noted in a careful postscript, which was the one that Eleanor had already considered. She and Nathaniel sat with the letter at the dinner table on a Wednesday evening in late September, with Mrs. Baines having quietly withdrawn and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, and they read it together. The legal challenge, she said. It's uncertain, he said. Mercer gives it even odds. The buyout. Webb won't take it. His voice was flat with certainty. I've tried before. He doesn't want money. He wants the land. She set the letter down. He was looking at her. The third avenue, he said. She looked back at him. I want to say something, she said, and I need you to hear it correctly. All right. Whatever we decide, she said, should not be decided because of a legal clause or a land deed or Aldous Webb. If we decide it for those reasons, we will have made a decision that is right legally and wrong in every other way, and both of us will know it, and we will have to live with it. She paused. Do you understand what I mean? He was very still. Yes, he said. So, she said, separate from the deed, separate from Webb, separate from all of it. She took a breath. I would like to know what you want. The question landed between them with a weight that had nothing to do with property law. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time, long enough that the candle on the table guttered once and steadied. I want... He stopped, started again. I have spent 6 years, he said, running this estate and these people and this... He gestured slightly at the house around them. 6 years doing it alone, being alone with it, and then you arrived, and you... Another stop. He looked at the letter on the table rather than at her. You reorganized the accounts in 4 days. You handled Webb without telling me. You had a plan for your father before I'd even decided what to say. You told me when I'd said something wrong, which no one has done in... He shook his head slightly. A long time. She waited. What I want, he said quietly, has very little to do with property law. The silence after that was the loudest thing Eleanor had experienced in some time. Then we pursue the legal challenge in parallel, she said, and her voice was remarkably steady. And we have a different conversation when we're ready to have it. He looked at her. "When will we be ready?" he said. "Soon," she said. "I think soon." She picked up the letter and began making notes in the margin. And Nathaniel sat across from her and watched her write and said nothing, and the candlelight moved across the table between them. And outside the Virginia night was full of crickets and the distant sound of wind in the eastern trees, and the house felt, for the first time, like something more than a structure containing two separate people. Charles Montgomery arrived in October. Eleanor had heard the name before their marriage. Montgomery was old Virginia money, the kind that had been old Virginia money for long enough that it had stopped needing to work very hard at anything and had turned its considerable energy toward managing the social landscape instead. Charles Montgomery specifically was 38, unmarried, charming in the particular way of men who had spent their whole lives being found charming, and had been, from what Eleanor could piece together from various sources, interested in Harrington land for a very long time. He arrived at a social gathering at the Harrington estate, the one social event of the year that Nathaniel hosted because it was expected, held in late October when the harvest was in, for the neighboring families and business connections and the general social structure of 3 counties. Eleanor had organized it because organization was what she did, and she had organized it well. And standing in her own house on an October evening surrounded by 200 people who were still slightly uncertain what to make of her, she felt the specific alertness of a woman who knows her position is being watched. She spotted Montgomery within 20 minutes of his arrival. He was the kind of man who was easy to spot, tall, easy in his movements, speaking to everyone with the warm familiarity of someone who considered the whole room his social property. He worked the edges of the gathering with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had a purpose. He reached her at the east side of the room, where she was speaking with a family whose farm she'd recently helped restructure, and he said her name with the warm assumption of someone who already knew her. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "what a remarkable thing Nathaniel has done, acquiring you." She looked at him. "He didn't acquire me," she said pleasantly. "We married. It's slightly different." Montgomery smiled. He had a very good smile. "Of course. I only mean that Harrington is a fortunate man. The county has been wondering when he'd settle." "Have they?" she said. "You must find it lonely," he said. "Out here. Nathaniel is not exactly a social creature. Not like you." His eyes moved over her face with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to make women feel seen. "You seem like someone who appreciates company." "I appreciate useful things," she said. "Company is useful when it's honest." She smiled at him, the same pleasant smile she'd used on Webb. "Are you planning to be honest with me, Mr. Montgomery?" Something shifted very slightly in his expression. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," he said. "I'm sure you do," she said, and turned back to the family she'd been speaking with. She told Nathaniel about it afterward, when the guests had gone and the house was settling back into itself. He was silent for longer than she expected. "Montgomery has been trying to purchase the eastern parcel for 5 years," he said. Something cold moved through her. "The eastern parcel," she said. "Webb's reversionary interest." "Yes." "Montgomery knows about the clause." "I believe so. And if Webb exercises the reversionary interest, Montgomery is positioned to buy directly from Webb." Nathaniel looked at her. "Yes." "They're working together," she said. It was not a question. The shape of it had become clear the moment the pieces aligned. Webb with his investor position and his reversionary claim. Montgomery with his charm and his social access and his willingness to appear at her house and talk to her about loneliness. 2 men. 1 strategy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "I wasn't certain," he said. "I didn't want to." "Don't," she said. "Don't say you didn't want to worry me. We are past that." He took the correction. "I wasn't certain of the connection, and I didn't want to put you in the position of knowing. If you knew, you would act on it, and acting on it would alert them that we were aware." Eleanor looked at him. "So you were protecting me," she said. "I was trying to." "Nathaniel." She said his name the way she might say "look at me," because it had the same effect. He met her eyes and stayed there. "I have managed this estate's accounts for 4 months. I handled Webb in the sitting room. I held off my father at the front door. I found the reversionary clause before your attorney did." She paused. "What exactly did you think you were protecting me from?" His jaw worked. "The weight of it," he said finally. "That's all. Not because I think you can't carry it. Because it was mine to carry. And you didn't sign on for—" "I signed on to be your wife," she said. "In this house. With these people. With everything that comes with all of it. The weight is not something you get to shield me from. It is something we carry together or not at all." The silence was very long. "Together," he said quietly. "Together," she agreed. He exhaled. Just once, just slightly, like a man who had been holding something for a long time and had been given permission to set it down. "Then here is what we know," she said, and pulled a piece of paper from the pocket of her dress because she had already started making notes, because of course she had. "Webb and Montgomery are coordinating. The reversionary clause is their mechanism. The goal is the eastern parcel. Mercer is pursuing the legal challenge, but even odds are not sufficient. We need a second approach." "I'm listening," he said. "Montgomery wants to be seen as a legitimate buyer," she said. "He's not trying to take the land by force. He's waiting for Webb to take it legally and then purchase it. That means the social dimension matters to him. He needs to be seen as the reasonable party in all of this." She tapped the paper. "Which means he has a reputation to protect." "And if his reputation is at risk," Nathaniel said slowly, "then he becomes very careful," she said. "And very careful men do not take risks. And if he withdraws his interest, Webb's strategy loses its exit. He can exercise the reversionary claim all he wants, but if there's no buyer waiting, he's left managing 3,000 acres of tenant farmland, which is not profitable, not at the scale he'd be inheriting, and not something Webb has any infrastructure to handle." Nathaniel was looking at her with that full, gray attention. "What does damaging Montgomery's reputation require?" he said. "The truth," she said, "which I intend to find." She found it in 3 weeks, through a combination of careful correspondence with the Charlottesville social network she had been quietly building since her arrival, and one very useful conversation with Margaret Holloway, a woman of 60 who had known the Montgomery family for 30 years, and who, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to ask her the right questions for approximately the last decade. Margaret came to tea on a Wednesday. She was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated by men and had used the experience productively. "Charles Montgomery," Margaret said, wrapping both hands around her teacup, "has a very interesting relationship with the Davenport estate in Henrico County." Eleanor set her own cup down. "Tell me," she said. Margaret told her. The Davenport estate had belonged to an old Virginia family. A widow, Margaret's distant cousin, who had died 3 years ago and left the property to her son, who was 12. Charles Montgomery had inserted himself as a financial advisor to the estate. He had provided a series of loans to cover the estate's operating costs. The loans were at an interest rate that was, on paper, within legal bounds, but which had been structured in a way that ensured the estate could not retire them. The boy would inherit debt, not land, when he came of age. It was entirely legal. It was entirely recognizable. Eleanor looked at Margaret Holloway across the tea table. "Can you document it?" she said. "I have the loan agreements," Margaret said. "My cousin gave them to me before she died. She didn't understand them, but she trusted me to keep them safe." A pause. "She never asked me what to do with them." "I'm asking," Eleanor said. Margaret set down her teacup. "I know you are," she said. "That's why I came." The gathering at the Calloway house in early November was the largest social event of the autumn season. 30 families, 2 county judges, 4 attorneys, and the full social weight of 3 counties assembled under one roof for the kind of evening where the real business of Virginia was conducted between conversations about the harvest and the weather. Montgomery was there. Webb was there, though Webb did not know Eleanor had found the Davenport documents because she had not told anyone beyond Nathaniel and Robert Mercer. Nathaniel did not want her to do it the way she was planning to do it. "There will be a scene," he said, the evening before. Yes, she said. It will become public. That's rather the point. Eleanor. He turned to face her fully. You don't have to be the one to do it. Mercer can file. Mercer can file a legal action that takes 2 years, she said. And in 2 years, the Davenport boy is 2 years older and 2 years deeper in debt. And the eastern parcel is still at risk, and the families on it are still exposed. She met his eyes. I can end this tomorrow evening. He was quiet. It's going to be unpleasant, he said. People will talk about you. People already talk about me, she said. I'm the woman who married you. Something crossed his face. That raw, open thing that she'd been watching appear more frequently over the past months. I don't want you to be hurt, he said. I know, she said. But here is the thing about that. She stepped forward slightly, close enough that she could see him very clearly. You have spent 6 years being quietly good in a world that called you cold, and you have not been hurt by what people said, because you decided that what you knew about yourself was more important than what they said. And what I know about myself is more important than what will be said tomorrow evening. She paused. This is what I am. This is what I do. Will you let me do it? He looked at her for a very long time. Yes, he said. She nodded. Thank you, she said. She went to prepare. She did it at 9 o'clock in the Callaway drawing room with 60 people in attendance. She did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene in the theatrical sense. What she did was walk up to Judge Harold Pemberton, the senior county judge, a man of impeccable reputation who she had been carefully cultivating since August, and hand him the Davenport loan documents, and then, quietly, in the judge's presence and in the hearing of the 6 people standing nearby, she explained what they were. The 6 people standing nearby were not random. She had positioned herself there 20 minutes earlier. She explained calmly that she had come into possession of documents suggesting that a prominent member of the community had structured financial arrangements with a minor's estate in a way that, while technically legal, appeared designed to ensure the minor would inherit nothing. She expressed, with great seriousness, her concern about the implications for the community's financial practices and the protection of estates belonging to minors and widows. She asked Judge Pemberton, given his position and his well-known commitment to proper conduct, whether he felt the documents warranted examination. Judge Pemberton took the documents. He read the first page. He looked at Eleanor. He looked across the room to where Charles Montgomery was standing with a glass of wine and had not yet registered what was happening. Mrs. Harrington, the judge said, and his voice was carrying because he was a man who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and his voice carried by instinct. These are serious documents. Yes, sir, she said. I believe they are. The conversation around them had gone quiet. The quiet was spreading, the way quiet always spread at gatherings when something more interesting than the usual conversation was developing. Montgomery looked up. He saw the documents in the judge's hands. He saw Eleanor standing beside the judge. And Eleanor watched his face go through the particular progression of a man who has just realized that the game he was playing has changed entirely, and that he does not know when the change happened. He set his wine down. He excused himself from the group he was with. He walked toward the door. Mr. Montgomery, Judge Pemberton said, without raising his voice. Montgomery stopped. I believe we'll need to speak, the judge said, at your earliest convenience. The room was very quiet. Aldous Webb, Eleanor noted from the far side of the room, had gone a particular shade of pale that told her he understood exactly what had happened, even if he didn't know how. Nathaniel was standing against the far wall, where she had told him to be, watching. He was very still. He did not look at her because she had asked him not to. She had asked him to remain at a distance and let the thing proceed without his presence beside her, because this needed to be Eleanor doing it, not Nathaniel's wife doing it on his behalf. He had agreed to that too. She stood in the center of the Callaway drawing room with 60 people around her and the documents in the judge's hands, and the very particular silence of a room full of people recalibrating, and she felt, not triumphant exactly, not vindicated, something quieter than that. She felt like herself, entirely, finally, without reservation or performance, herself. Judge Pemberton turned to speak to her again, and she answered his questions. And across the room, Montgomery was being asked by two other men to explain what he knew about the Davenport estate, and Webb was moving toward the door with the careful speed of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. And Eleanor stood steady in the middle of all of it, and did not look across the room for Nathaniel. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. The ride home from the Calloway house was quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. Not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say, or who were carefully avoiding what needed to be said. It was the quiet of aftermath. The quiet of a thing finished. Eleanor sat across from Nathaniel in the carriage and watched the dark Virginia countryside pass and let herself simply breathe for the first time in 3 weeks. Nathaniel watched her. She could feel it without looking at him. That particular quality of his attention that she had come to recognize the way you recognize weather changing. He watched her the way he watched land he cared about, trying to understand how it was. "You're not going to say anything," she said. "I'm waiting," he said. "For what?" "For whatever comes after," he said. "You're still processing." She looked at him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I've been paying attention since June," he said quietly. The carriage rolled on. Outside, the night was cold and clear and very still. "I don't know if it was enough," she said finally. "What I did tonight. The documents implicate Montgomery clearly enough. Pemberton will act on them. But Webb—" She stopped. "Webb isn't done." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He isn't. He'll withdraw from the investment partnership. He has enough cause now, or he'll manufacture enough cause, to exit the financial arrangement and convert his position to whatever leverage he still holds through the reversionary clause." "Mercer's challenge. Even odds," she said. "You said so yourself. Mercer said so himself." She pressed her lips together. "I need to think about it." "Tonight?" he said. "I don't know yet." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Eleanor." "Nathaniel, stop," he said gently. "Just stop. For tonight." She looked at him. "The documents are with Pemberton," he said. "Montgomery is finished in 3 counties, whether he knows it yet or not. Webb is scared. Mercer is working." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the way he sat when he was being direct. "You have done more tonight than most people manage in a year. Stop solving problems for one evening." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know how to do that," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "I have the same problem." And somehow the simple plainness of it, the fact of him knowing exactly what she meant because he carried the same particular weight, undid something in her that the whole elaborate evening had not been able to touch. "I'm very tired," she said. "I know," he said. She did not cry. That would have required a different sort of person. But she leaned back against the carriage seat and let the tension go out of her shoulders. And she closed her eyes. And for the remaining 20 minutes of the drive home, she allowed herself to simply exist in the dark, in the quiet, while Nathaniel sat across from her and kept watch the way he kept watch over everything he cared for, without announcement, without fanfare, simply and completely. Judge Pemberton moved faster than Eleanor had expected. By Friday, Montgomery had been formally asked to account for the Davenport loan structures before a civil review. By the following Monday, the Davenport estate situation had been referred to a trustee appointed by the court, which meant Montgomery's access to the estate's finances was immediately frozen pending examination. By Wednesday, 3 other families had come forward with similar documents concerning Montgomery-structured loans, which told Eleanor that she had not found the whole of it, only the piece that Margaret Holloway had been keeping. Margaret came to tea again on Thursday, and she sat in the Harrington sitting room with her hands folded and the expression of a woman who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it on the floor. "There are others," Eleanor said. "There are others," Margaret confirmed. "I didn't know how many. I knew about my cousin. 2 other women have spoken to me in the last 3 days. They heard what happened at the Calloway house. They'll come forward to Pemberton?" "They're afraid," Margaret said. "Montgomery is, even with the review, he has social standing, connections. They're afraid of what happens after." Eleanor looked at her. "Tell them," she said, "that the time to be afraid of a man is before you act, not after. After, the only thing left is the thing you built by acting." Margaret looked at her with something that was partly respect and partly the specific, complicated feeling of a woman who had needed someone to say that to her 20 years ago. "I'll tell them," she said. Webb came to Harrington Manor on a Friday morning, and he did not come alone. He brought a man named Silas Croft, an attorney from Richmond who specialized, Mercer had told her, in property disputes and who was known for being thorough and unpleasant in equal measure. He also brought 2 associates who were not attorneys and whose presence communicated a particular kind of intent. The intent to be larger in a room than the other people in it. Mrs. Baines came to find Eleanor in the estate office. Her face was perfectly composed, which Eleanor had learned meant the opposite of composed underneath. "Mr. Webb is in the front hall," she said, "with company." "How many?" "4. Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at the account books on her desk. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Bring them to the study," she said. "Not the sitting room, the study." The difference mattered. The sitting room was sociable. The study was the room where estate business happened, where Nathaniel's land maps covered the walls and the deed cabinets stood along one side, and the entire physical evidence of what Harrington was and what it stood on made itself felt in the bones of the room. She sent Patience to find Nathaniel. He was somewhere on the eastern property. She sent word to bring him back as quickly as possible, but she did not wait. Waiting would have conceded something she wasn't prepared to concede. She walked into the study, and she sat behind the desk. She did not stand to receive them. Webb came in with Croft at his shoulder and his associates behind him, and he looked at Eleanor behind the desk with the expression of a man who had expected to find a wife and found something else. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not," he said. He settled into the chair across from her without being invited. Croft stood at his right shoulder. The associates arranged themselves near the door. "I'll be brief, Mrs. Harrington. My attorney has reviewed my position under the existing land deed, and we believe the reversionary clause is fully enforceable. I am here as a courtesy, to inform Mr. Harrington of my intention to file for enforcement before the end of the month." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Harrington is on the property," she said. "He'll be here shortly. However—" She opened the desk drawer. "I've been expecting this conversation for some time, so I'm prepared to begin without him." She placed 3 documents on the desk. Webb looked at them. Croft leaned forward. "The first document," she said, "is a legal opinion from Robert Mercer of Lexington, addressing the enforceability of the reversionary clause, given that 2 of the 3 named trust administrators are deceased, and the trust has not been formally reconstituted per the founding document's own requirements." She tapped it. "Mr. Mercer's opinion is that the clause is, at minimum, legally contestable, and that enforcement would require the court to first rule on the reconstitution question. He estimates 12 to 18 months for that ruling." Webb's face was very still. "The second document," she said, "is a notice of formal legal review from Judge Pemberton's office, which I received yesterday, and which pertains to an investigation into financial irregularities in several estate matters involving Mr. Charles Montgomery." She set it neatly beside the first. "Mr. Montgomery, as I believe you're aware, was the intended purchaser of the Eastern Harrington parcel should the reversionary clause be exercised. The review is expected to conclude within 90 days. Given the nature of the irregularities under investigation, it is the judge's view that any land transaction involving Mr. Montgomery should be considered pending that review." Croft straightened. "That review has nothing to do," he began. "The third document," Eleanor said, and Croft stopped. She placed the third document on the desk. "Is a sworn affidavit from 3 former employees of the Webb commercial operation in Charlottesville, attesting to certain practices in Webb's own financial arrangements with small landholders in Albemarle County between 1809 and 1813. She looked at Webb. "I'd be happy to summarize the contents, but I imagine you're familiar with them." The room was very quiet. Aldous Webb looked at the 3 documents on the desk. He looked at Eleanor. His face had gone through several stages and arrived at something that was not quite rage and not quite fear, and was significantly less comfortable than either. "Where did you get that affidavit?" he said. "It was provided to me by individuals who wished to ensure the information was properly documented," she said, "in case it became relevant." "It is not relevant." "It is relevant," she said pleasantly, "if you choose to pursue a public legal proceeding about the Harrington estate. Because public legal proceedings are public, Mr. Webb, and the contents of affidavits presented in those proceedings become part of the public record." She paused. "Which would be unfortunate, I think, for a man with commercial interests throughout the county." Silas Croft put his hand on Webb's arm. It was a small gesture, but Eleanor read it clearly, the attorney telling his client to stop talking. The study door opened. Nathaniel came in. He did not look as though he had ridden fast to get here, though he must have. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, Webb and Croft and the associates and Eleanor behind the desk. And then he came in and stood beside the desk, not behind Eleanor but beside her, which placed them level. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Webb looked at him. "Mr. Harrington," he said. "Aldous," Nathaniel said. Not a greeting. Not quite. Webb looked at the documents on the desk. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathaniel. Croft leaned forward and said quietly into Webb's ear, and Webb listened, and his face settled into something that was a decision being made. He stood. "We'll be in touch through the appropriate legal channels," he said. "Mr. Mercer will be happy to correspond with Mr. Croft at any time," Eleanor said. "Good morning, Mr. Webb." They left. The house settled around the departure the way a house settles. The sound of the front door, footsteps on the drive, horses, and then quiet. Nathaniel did not move for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from Eleanor and sat down, the way he had on her first night here, and looked at the 3 documents on the desk. "The affidavit," he said. "Margaret Holloway's contacts in Charlottesville," she said. "It took 2 weeks to locate and document, but the information existed. It just needed someone to go looking." He shook his head once, slowly, with the expression of a man who keeps expecting to stop being surprised and keeps failing. "Will he file?" Nathaniel said. "Croft won't let him," she said. "Not now. The risk calculation has changed. Filing a public proceeding opens his own practices to scrutiny, loses him the ready buyer, and faces an 18-month legal challenge before the enforcement question is even settled. It's not a good position." She paused. "He'll look for another exit." "What exit?" "That," she said, "is the part I'm still working on." He looked at her. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked back. "I need to know," she said, "everything about the original investment arrangement. Every conversation, every letter, every informal agreement that was made when Webb became an investor." "That was 6 years ago." "I know. Tell me anyway," he told her. It took the better part of 2 hours, sitting across from each other in the study with the land maps on the walls and the late autumn light coming through the window. And Eleanor wrote while he talked, and somewhere in the middle of it she realized that this right here, the 2 of them working at a problem together with their whole attention, was the thing she had not known she was looking for until she had it. The exit she found was this. Webb had originally entered the investment arrangement under terms that included a right of withdrawal, exercisable under specific conditions, one of which was a material change in the estate's financial management structure. Eleanor's reorganization of the accounts, the thing she had done in her first week, the thing she had done to protect the families and the school, constituted, under a narrow but defensible reading of the original investment agreement, exactly that kind of material change. She found it on a Thursday evening and stared at it for a long time. Then she called Nathaniel into the office. He read where she was pointing. "If Webb withdraws under this provision," she said, "he exits the investment with his principal returned and no further claim on the estate. He loses the profit position, but he was never primarily in this for profit." She paused. "If we offer him the exit, frame it as a mutual recognition that the management structure has changed and that he might prefer to redeploy his capital elsewhere. He can take it without losing face publicly." Nathaniel looked at the document. "You're giving him a door," he said. "I'm giving him a door that leads away from us," she said. "He takes it, and he walks away with his money and his reputation intact, and no public proceeding, and no affidavit, and no scrutiny from Pemberton's review spilling onto his own practices. And the reversionary clause. If he exits the investment, his legal standing to be a trust administrator becomes complicated. Mercer can argue it, with the trust reconstitution question already in play. She looked at him. It's not guaranteed, but it's the best position we can put ourselves in without a full court proceeding. Nathaniel sat with it for a long moment. He may not take it, he said. He may not, she agreed. But Croft will tell him to. Croft has been looking for an exit that doesn't destroy his client since the morning in this office. She watched Nathaniel think through it, the way his mind worked, which she had come to know the way you came to know the rhythms of a place you lived in. Methodical, thorough, slower than hers in some ways, faster in others. Draft the letter, he said. I'll need you to sign it. I know. He met her eyes. Draft it. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. It was, she thought, the most complete statement of trust she had ever been offered. Don't say that, she said. Read what I draft. Ask questions. Sign it because you've decided it's right, not because you trust me. He looked at her with an expression she was becoming familiar with. That combination of surprise and something deeper. Something that had to do with the fact that she kept saying the things people around him apparently never said. Both, he said. I'll read it because it's right, and I'll sign it because I trust you. That, she said, is acceptable. Webb accepted the exit 3 weeks later, through Croft, through Mercer, with a minimum of correspondence and a maximum of efficiency. The investment was wound down. The principal was returned. The letter from Mercer, which arrived the following Tuesday, stated that in his legal opinion, Webb's standing as trust administrator had been substantially undermined by his exit from the investment relationship, and that any attempt to exercise the reversionary clause would now face significant additional legal hurdles. Not eliminated, not impossible, but significantly harder. Eleanor read the letter in the estate office and set it down and sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work, because the work was never entirely done, and she had learned to find something like peace in that fact rather than something like burden. Patience knocked on the office door at 4 o'clock with tea and the news that Mrs. Baines had decided to make the particular apple cake that she only made for special occasions, which was its own form of communication. Tell Mrs. Baines that is not necessary, Eleanor said. Yes, ma'am, Patience said, and then stood there. She's going to make it anyway, Eleanor said. She's already made it, ma'am. Eleanor pressed her lips together against something that was very close to a smile. Thank you, Patience, she said. December came in cold and definitive, the way December came in Virginia, with frost on the windows before dawn and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney on the property. The harvest was long done. The legal matters were settled into the quiet back and forth of correspondence and careful positioning that would continue for months or years, probably, because men like Webb did not simply stop. They regrouped. But the immediate crisis had passed, and the eastern parcel stood, and the 14 families on it were still there, and the school in Louisville was still receiving its quarterly disbursements, now listed cleanly and defensibly in the account books under a heading Eleanor had created, and which she was privately quite satisfied with. She and Nathaniel had found, by December, a version of their days that felt like something it had not felt like in June. It felt like a life. Not the life she had imagined at 17, when life was still largely theoretical. Not the life she had been bracing for when she folded her father's letter and prepared herself for whatever Harrington Manor was going to be. Something else. Something that had built itself out of account ledgers and survey maps and dinners that ran long because they kept finding things to say, and mornings where she came down to find that he had already made notes on a question she'd raised the evening before, because he had been thinking about it in the night. She had told him, one evening in late November, about her mother. Not the abbreviated version she'd told him before. The bare facts of her mother's life, and the household management, and the quiet, uncredited competence. The full version. The way her mother used to sit at the kitchen table before anyone else was awake and go through the accounts with her face in a particular configuration that was not sadness exactly, but was the expression of someone doing necessary work in the full knowledge that the necessity would never be acknowledged. Nathaniel had listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "She would have reorganized my accounts in 3 days." Eleanor looked at him. "Probably 2, she said. He smiled at that. A real smile. Not the almost smiles she had catalogued from the early months, but a full one. And she found it startled her every time, how different his face was when he actually smiled. "I think about that sometimes," she said, more quietly. What she would have done with room, with resources, with a household that actually functioned. She paused. She was brilliant. Nobody knew. "You know," he said. "I know," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. Nothing declarative. Just his hand over hers on the dinner table in the December candlelight. And she turned her hand over and let his fingers close around hers. And they sat like that for a while without saying anything. And it was the quietest and most complete thing that had happened in the whole long, complicated year. The conversation came on a Sunday in mid-December, which was not planned. She had been in the estate office, and he had come in after his morning ride, and he had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her, and then he had said, "Eleanor." She had looked up. "I have something to say," he said, "and I want to say it properly this time." She put down her pen. He came in and sat across from her, and he did not look at the desk or the walls or the window. He looked at her. "I have spent 6 years," he said, "not trusting people, not because I decided not to, because I tried, repeatedly, and the results were—" He paused. "The results were Aldous Webb and James Caldwell, and a property that required hiding to protect, and a reputation. I built deliberately because it kept people far enough away that they couldn't damage what I was trying to do." She listened. "And then your letter arrived," he said, "and it was the most direct, unadorned, completely honest piece of correspondence I had received from anyone in 6 years, and I thought—" He stopped again, gathered himself. "I thought, this is someone who is not performing." "I wasn't," she said. "I know," he said. "And I want you to know that I—" He looked at her with those gray eyes, the eyes that had always been assessing, that had been filing her away since the first morning she opened her father's door. "What I feel for you is not gratitude. It is not respect, though it is that too. It is not convenience or partnership or any of the practical words we have been very carefully using all year." The room was very quiet. "I know what it is," he said, "because I have not felt it before, and there is nothing else it could be." He paused. "I love you. That's what I want to say properly. I love you, and I want you to know it. And I am not saying it because of the deed or the clause or any legal calculation. I am saying it because you asked me, months ago, to notice when I was treating a person like a function. And I have noticed that I stopped being able to do that with you a very long time ago." Eleanor sat with it. She sat with all of it, the whole year, the burned letter and the first morning, the ledgers and the Webb confrontation and the dinner table and his hand over hers. "I am not," she said carefully, "a woman who uses words carelessly." "I know," he said. "So when I say something to you, it will mean exactly what it says." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the stable in September, when you laughed when you didn't know I was listening, and I thought, there he is. That's the actual man." She paused. "I have been waiting for the right moment, and I think the right moment is probably just the moment when it's true." He stood up. She stood up. They were on the same side of the desk, which neither of them had entirely planned, and he put his hands on her face the way someone handles something they are careful with, and she put her hand flat against his chest, and the warmth of him was the most real thing she had felt in a very long time. "I want to do this right," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next, the deed, the legal work, all of it. I want to do it because we've decided together, not because of any clause." "I know," she said. "And I want—" He stopped. "I want you to have everything you were supposed to have. The room to be exactly what you are, without performing, without managing what other people can handle." She looked up at him. "You already gave me that," she said. "The first week. I want to keep giving it," he said. For the rest of our lives. She stood there with her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady, which was the most reassuring thing she could possibly have discovered about Nathaniel Harrington at this particular moment. "That," she said, "is acceptable." He made the sound again, that short, involuntary, utterly genuine sound. And she felt it against her hand, and she smiled, and it was the real kind. Outside, December moved across the Virginia land, cold and clear and inexhaustible, and inside the estate office of Harrington Manor. Two people who had arrived in each other's lives through necessity and stayed through something considerably more than that stood in the December light and held on to what they had built, and it was solid, and it was theirs. The new year came in quietly, the way things came in at Harrington Manor now, without announcement, without ceremony, with the particular settled confidence of a house that knew what it was. Eleanor stood in the estate office on the first morning of 1817 and looked at the account books lined up on the shelf, the old ones she had inherited and the new ones she had built, and felt the year behind her like something physical, like a distance crossed. She was not the woman who had burned her father's letter in June. She was not less than that woman. She was more, in the way that things become more when they have been tested and held. She pulled out a fresh ledger, the third one she had started since her arrival, the largest, and wrote the date at the top of the first page in her clearest hand, and then she went downstairs to breakfast. Nathaniel was already at the table, which was not unusual anymore. He had coffee and a survey map and the expression of a man thinking about the eastern fence line again, which was a perpetual occupation. He looked up when she came in. He smiled, that real smile, the one she had been cataloging since September, and which still, every single time, did something to her composure that she refused to acknowledge publicly. "Happy New Year," he said. "Happy New Year," she said, and sat down, and poured her coffee, and reached across the table and turned the survey map right side up so she could see what he was looking at. "The Henderson boundary," he said. "Still. The formal survey results came back yesterday. The line falls exactly where I said it would." "Then the Caldwell boy has nothing," she said. "He knows." Nathaniel sat back. "His attorney sent word last week. They're prepared to acknowledge the established boundary." "Good." She looked at the map. "What about the water access?" "Still offered." He paused. "He hasn't responded to that part." "He'll take it," she said. "Pride will slow him down. The logic will win eventually." Nathaniel looked at her. "You're very certain about people," he said. "I'm certain about what people want when they're not busy trying to appear like they don't want it," she said. "That's a slightly different thing." He made a sound that was somewhere between agreement and amusement, and poured her more coffee without being asked, because he had learned exactly how she took it, and had stopped making a production of remembering. These were the mornings now. This was what they had built. She had not known, in June, that this was what a good life felt like from the inside. She had known, theoretically, that such things existed. She had not known that they felt so ordinary. Not in a diminished sense. Ordinary in the sense of being real, being sustainable, being the kind of thing you could actually live in day after day without it requiring performance. She thought about that sometimes. How much of her life before had been performance, managing what her father could not, presenting a composure she did not always feel, being the practical center of a family that needed one without ever being allowed to say so. And how strange and quiet and solid it was to simply be in a house where she did not have to do any of that. "Mercer is coming Tuesday," Nathaniel said. She pulled herself back. "The trust reconstitution matter? He thinks he has enough to file the formal challenge. He'll need the 1798 founding documents. He has them. I sent copies in November." She nodded. The reversionary clause was not dead yet. Webb had not filed and had shown no signs of filing, which was its own kind of victory. But the legal vulnerability still existed and would exist until Mercer had formally resolved the trust question. She had not stopped thinking about it. She suspected she would not stop thinking about it until the matter was fully closed, because she was the kind of person who did not stop thinking about things until they were fully closed. "There's something else," Nathaniel said. She looked up at his tone. "Thomas is coming," he said. Your father. She set her coffee cup down. When? He sent word yesterday. He plans to arrive Friday. A pause. He didn't specify why. Eleanor looked at the survey map on the table without seeing it. He never specifies why, she said. No. She sat with it for the moment. Her father's previous visit had ended with a budget plan and a lesson in what the family arrangement did and did not include. She had thought that was clear. She had thought it would hold. He needs something again, she said. Probably, Nathaniel said. He did not say it with contempt. He said it with the particular gentleness of someone who understood that the relationship between Eleanor and her father was complicated in a way that required gentleness and not judgment. That, too, was something she had come to know about him, the way he handled the things that were tender to her. Let him come, she said. I'll deal with it. You don't have to deal with it alone, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. No, she said. I don't. Her father arrived Friday afternoon with Clara, which was unexpected. Eleanor saw them from the window, her father on his horse, still carrying himself with the last remnants of a dignity that the Whitfield finances had long since stopped supporting, and Clara beside him in a traveling dress, 16 years old, with the particular brightness of someone who had never been required to be the practical one, and who therefore still had all her brightness intact. Something moved in Eleanor's chest at the sight of Clara. She had not seen her sister since the wedding. She went to the front door herself and opened it before they reached the steps, and Clara saw her, and her face did the thing it always did, open, warm, entirely unguarded, and she was off her horse and up the steps in a motion that bypassed formality entirely. Eleanor, she said, and hugged her the way she had always hugged her, which was completely and without reserve. Eleanor held on for a moment longer than she intended. Clara, she said, you've grown. Everyone says that, Clara said, pulling back. I'm the exact same size. You just stopped seeing me every day. She looked at the house behind Eleanor with wide eyes. It's enormous. It's large, Eleanor agreed. Thomas Whitfield came up the steps with his hat in his hand and his expression doing something complicated. The expression of a man who was trying to be a father and finding it slightly more difficult than expected in the face of the evidence that his daughter had built something without him. Eleanor, he said. Father, she said, come in. Nathaniel was in the front hall, which she had asked him to be. He had met her father once before, at the wedding, and the dynamic then had been transactional. Two men making an arrangement. This was different. This was her father arriving at the house where his daughter lived and encountering the man she had chosen to build it with. Thomas Whitfield looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Thomas Whitfield. Mr. Harrington, her father said. Mr. Whitfield, Nathaniel said. Welcome to the manor. I hope the ride was comfortable. He said it simply, without warmth, performance, and without coolness either. Just the direct, honest civility that was his natural mode, which Eleanor had stopped finding surprising and had started finding deeply settling. Her father relaxed slightly. She watched it happen, the slight drop in the shoulders of a man who had been braced for something and had not found it. Mrs. Baines materialized and took their coats, and Clara immediately started asking her questions about the house, and Mrs. Baines answered all of them with the patience she reserved for people she had already decided she liked, which told Eleanor something about the speed at which Mrs. Baines made assessments. Thomas drew her aside before dinner. She had expected it. She let him tell her what he needed, which was, as she had anticipated, another financial intervention. Not the estate this time. A debt of his own, a private one, smaller but more immediate. He had borrowed from a neighbor in August, he said, and the neighbor was no longer willing to wait. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "How much?" He told her. She thought for a moment, doing the arithmetic. It was within her personal allowance. $300 per annum, independent, hers. She had been careful with it, not from scarcity, but from habit, and from the knowledge that a woman's financial independence was precious and should not be casually dispersed. She had 3 months of it saved. "I'll give you what I have saved," she said. "That covers half. For the other half, I can show you how to restructure the Whitfield estate income to free up the remainder within 6 months." Her father looked at her. "That's not—" He stopped. "It's what I can do," she said. "It's everything I can do, within my own resources, which are my own. I will not ask Mr. Harrington for money on your behalf. I said that clearly in September, and I mean it the same way now." He was quiet. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a long time. Not the voice he used when he wanted something. The other voice. The one he had when she was young, and he was still the kind of man who carried her on his shoulders. "I know I haven't. I know I'm not." "Father," she said gently. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know what you haven't been. I've known for a long time." She paused. "But I'm not doing this because of what you owe me. I'm doing it because Clara needs a roof and a family, and helping you is the most direct way to help her." She looked at him. "That's honest. I want you to hear it honestly." He looked at the floor for a moment. "You're very like your mother," he said quietly. "In the useful ways," she said. Something broke in his face. Briefly, just briefly. And then he gathered himself and nodded, and she let him have the gathering, because some dignities mattered even when they were mostly borrowed. Clara found her that evening in the estate office. She did not knock so much as knock and enter simultaneously, which had been her method since she was 3 years old. She came in and looked at the ledgers and the maps and the organized stacks of paper, and then looked at Eleanor with an expression of genuine wonder. "You run this," she said. "I manage the accounts," Eleanor said. "You run it," Clara said. "Mrs. Baines told me. She said—" She hesitated, then decided honesty was worth more than tact. "She said that before you came, the house was well maintained but cold, and now it's—" She gestured, unable to find the word. "Functional," Eleanor suggested. "I was going to say alive," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her sister for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what's actually happening at home." Clara sat, and she talked, and Eleanor listened the way she had always listened to Clara, with her full attention, without interrupting, without framing it into something more manageable than it was. The Whitfield estate was stable, but brittle. Their father was better than he had been, but still not reliable. Clara was managing more than a 16-year-old should manage, because that was what happened when one daughter left and the practical work still needed doing. "You need help," Eleanor said. "I manage," Clara said, with the particular brightness of someone who had learned to say this instead of the other thing. "Clara." Clara stopped. "You're doing what I did," Eleanor said. "At 17. Her sister looked at her. "It's all right," Clara said. "It shouldn't have to be," Eleanor said. "It's not all right that it falls on you. It's what's happening, which is different." She paused. "I'm going to write to Father tonight about the estate restructuring. I'll make it detailed enough that he can actually follow it, which I should have done in September, instead of assuming he'd develop organizational skills at 56. She looked at Clara. "And I want you to write to me, every month. Tell me what's actually happening. Don't manage me." Clara blinked. "You'd want to know?" "I've always wanted to know," Eleanor said. "I was just not there to ask." Clara's face did the thing it did, that open, unguarded warmth. And she leaned forward and put her head on Eleanor's shoulder the way she had when she was much smaller. And Eleanor sat very still and let her, and thought about the particular weight of being the one people leaned on, and how it was different when you were not doing it entirely alone. "He's good to you," Clara said quietly. "Mr. Harrington, I can tell." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Is it—" Clara hesitated. "Is it what you thought it would be?" Eleanor thought about June. She thought about the burned letter and the first conversation, and the way he had said, "I did not purchase you," and the estate office on the first night, and the accounts, and Webb and Montgomery, and the Callaway house, and December. "No," she said honestly. "It's considerably better than anything I thought it would be." The twist came from the direction she had not been watching. It always did. Mercer arrived on Tuesday as planned, with the documents for the trust challenge and the careful, organized manner of a man who had done his work thoroughly. He sat across from Eleanor and Nathaniel in the study, and laid out the legal argument in the clean, sequential way that good attorneys laid out things that had taken months to assemble. The trust was, in his opinion, technically defunct. The founding documents required the full three-administrator structure to remain active for any enforcement action to be valid. With two administrators deceased and no formal reconstitution having occurred, the clause was procedurally unenforceable without a court first ordering the trust to be reconstituted, which was the 18-month proceeding he had previously identified, and which Webb had apparently decided was not worth the scrutiny it would invite. It was good news. Clear, solid, well-documented good news. And then Mercer said, "There is, however, one complication." Eleanor went very still. "The founding documents," Mercer said carefully, "include a secondary provision I did not fully appreciate on first reading. The reversionary clause is linked not only to the failure of the direct mail line, but to a related condition." He looked at both of them. "The clause is automatically suspended, not eliminated, but suspended indefinitely, upon the birth of a legitimate heir." The room was quiet. "Suspended," Nathaniel said. "The language is clear," Mercer said. "The clause becomes dormant upon the birth of a legitimate heir of the estate." Dormant, not void. But dormant means Webb cannot act on it, cannot file on it, and cannot use it as leverage for any purpose whatsoever. Indefinitely. Eleanor looked at the document in Mercer's hands. She did not look at Nathaniel. She could feel him not looking at her. "The legal challenge remains worth filing," Mercer continued, apparently understanding that he had dropped something significant into the room and that the room needed a moment. "The procedural argument is sound regardless, but I wanted you both to be aware of the full picture." "Thank you, Robert," Nathaniel said. "I'll read the documents tonight." Mercer understood a dismissal when he heard one. He was good at his job in multiple ways. He left the documents, and he left the room and the house, and the sound of his horse on the drive faded, and the study settled back into its December quiet. Eleanor looked at the documents on the desk. Nathaniel looked at the documents on the desk. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm not." "I know you're not," she said. "I know what you're not going to say. I know what you're not going to ask." She paused. "I just need a moment." He was quiet. He was very good at being quiet in ways that gave her room. She sat with it. The clause. The suspension. The thing that was not a demand, and was not a condition, and was not something he had arranged or anticipated, but which was sitting on the desk in the document Mercer had just left. An option, a fact, a possibility. She had not thought about children. She had not thought about it with deliberateness, which was its own kind of answer about where her mind had been these past months. So thoroughly occupied with the work of building what they had that the question of what might grow from it had not had room to form. But now it had room. And she sat with it, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that sitting with it was not the kind of sitting with something that made her want to move away from it. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. This is not about the clause. I know. If I tell you what I want, it is separate from the clause and from Webb and from the legal position and from everything except what I actually want." "I understand," he said. "And what I tell you is also separate from all of it. What I want has nothing to do with the document." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I would like," she said, "to have a family with you, when the time is right, not because of a clause, because this is the life I want to build, and I want to build all of it." He was very still. "Yes," he said quietly. "So would I." "Good," she said, and reached for the document Mercer had left. "Then let's read what he brought and decide how to proceed." He reached across and covered her hand with his, briefly, the way he had at the dinner table in December. Just that. Just long enough. Then they read the documents together. January became February, and February became the particular Virginia spring that arrived like an argument. Cold one morning, warm the next, impossible to predict, and completely convincing once it committed. The Eastern Properties' first full year under Eleanor's restructured management produced results that were, by any measure, significantly better than the previous 5-year average, which she noted in the accounts with the satisfaction of a person who had been right about something she had worked hard to be right about. The Caldwell boy accepted the water access offer. Mercer filed the formal trust challenge in March and received an initial response from the court that Mercer characterized as favorable, which Mercer never said unless he meant it. Webb was quiet. He had been quiet since November. Eleanor was not naive enough to believe that quiet meant finished. She had built a filing system for everything they knew about Webb's practices and financial positions, updated monthly, because the kind of man who used a reversionary clause as leverage for 6 years was the kind of man who found other leverage. But quiet was what they had, and she worked with what they had. Montgomery, for his part, had withdrawn from 3 counties entirely. The civil review had concluded with the settlement that required him to restructure the Davenport loans at no interest and to divest himself of 2 other estate advisory positions. He had not been publicly ruined. She had not wanted public ruin. She had wanted the children and widows protected, and they were protected, which was the point. But his social position in Albemarle County and surrounding areas was something considerably less than it had been in October, and he seemed to have understood that the change was permanent. Margaret Holloway came to tea monthly now. She had a particular gift for knowing things, and Eleanor had a particular gift for using information responsibly, and the combination was, both of them agreed, productive. The school expanded in April. Thomas, the freedman teacher in Louisville, whom Nathaniel had been supporting for 6 years, sent a letter in March explaining that enrollment had grown to 34 students and that the current structure was no longer adequate for the number of children. He asked, carefully and without expectation in his phrasing, whether there was any possibility of support for an additional room. Eleanor read the letter first, because she read all the correspondence first. She went to find Nathaniel in the stable and stood in the doorway and read it aloud. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "What do you think?" She looked at him. "I think we build the room," she said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Right back today." She went back to the office and wrote the response. She authorized the funds from the estate account under the educational investment line item, documented cleanly and completely. She wrote a separate personal note to Thomas, not from the estate, from herself, and she told him that 34 children learning to read was one of the better things she had heard in a long time. Thomas wrote back 3 weeks later. He thanked them both. He mentioned that 2 of his older students had expressed interest in attending the academy in Lexington, following the 2 young men Nathaniel had already been funding there. Eleanor added it to the accounts before Nathaniel had finished reading the letter. He caught her doing it. "You didn't ask me," he said, but he was not actually asking about permission. He was asking about the speed. "You were going to say yes," she said. "I was. I saved us both a conversation." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply started accepting as the face of a man who kept finding that he did not regret what had happened to his life. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel, I want to say something." She put down her pen. "Say it," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what the estate is, what it should be, not just the land and the accounts and the legal structure." He paused. "What we are building here." She waited. "I think," he said slowly, "that I spent 6 years building something defensible, something that would survive. And I did not. I couldn't think beyond surviving, because surviving was what each day required." He looked at the wall, at the maps, then back at her. "And you came here, and in the first week you reorganized the accounts, and in the first month you faced down Webb, and in the first year you changed everything. And I realize now that what changed was not the accounts or the legal position or the social standing." He stopped. "What changed was that I stopped thinking about surviving and started thinking about what comes next." Eleanor looked at him. "What comes next?" she said. "The school," he said. "The families. Thomas and his students. The Davenport boy when he comes of age and finds his estate intact. The Henderson family on their boundary line." He paused. "Children, eventually. If you—" "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. He crossed to the desk and stood close to her and put his hands on either side of her face, the way he had in December. And this time, she didn't have her hand flat against his chest. She put her arms around him, and she held on, and he held on too. And outside, the spring was arguing with itself, and the Eastern property was waking up. And in the accounts on the desk behind her, the numbers balanced cleanly. Every line documented, every family accounted for, every school and every child and every quiet, unremarked act of decency in its proper place.
真的，
The letter from Webb came in May. Not a legal filing, not a threat. A letter, formal and brief, from Silas Croft on Webb's behalf, stating that in light of the ongoing legal proceedings regarding the trust structure and in consideration of current circumstances, Mr. Webb wished to formally relinquish any claim or interest under the reversionary provision of the Harrington Land Deed of 1798, without condition, effective immediately. Eleanor read it twice. She sent for Mercer. Mercer confirmed by Thursday that the relinquishment was valid, properly executed, and binding. He added, in a postscript that she appreciated for its restraint, that the timing suggested Webb had received information about the changed circumstances at the estate that made the clause no longer strategically useful to him. She knew what information that was. She was 3 months along. She had told Nathaniel in February, on a Tuesday morning over coffee, in exactly the same tone she used for important account decisions. He had set his coffee cup down very carefully and looked at her for a long moment, and then stood up and came around the table and held her, which was not his typical mode of response to news, and which therefore told her everything she needed to know about how he felt about it. She told Mrs. Baines the same week. Mrs. Baines had said, "I'll adjust the household arrangements," and then had made the apple cake again without any occasion at all. Patience had cried briefly and then pretended she hadn't. Eleanor sent word to Clara, who wrote back a letter that was 6 pages long and entirely in Clara's voice, which was the best letter Eleanor had received in her life. Her father had come again in March, not for money this time. He had come because Clara had told him to come, and because he was, underneath the years of poor decisions and comfortable self-deception, a man who was trying, in whatever diminished way he had available, to be better. He had sat across from Nathaniel at dinner, and they had talked about the land for an hour, and Eleanor had watched it happen. 2 men who had arrived in each other's lives through an arrangement, and who were finding, slowly and without forcing it, something that resembled a workable relationship. He had looked at Eleanor before he left and said, "You're well." It was not a question. "I'm well," she said. "Good," he said. And then quietly, "Your mother would have been—" He stopped. "She would have been very glad." Eleanor looked at him. "I know," she said. "I think about her here sometimes. She would have had opinions about the accounts." Her father made a sound that was the closest he had come to a genuine laugh in some time. "She always had opinions about the accounts." "She was always right," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. "She was." By summer, the summer of 1817, exactly 1 year from the summer, Eleanor had burned her father's letter in the fireplace. Harrington Manor had 41 students enrolled in the Louisville school. The 2 young men at the Lexington Academy had been joined by a third. The Caldwell boundary dispute had been resolved, and the water access was being used, as Eleanor had predicted, and the Caldwell boy had sent a brief note through his attorney that was not quite gratitude, but was as close as pride would let him get. The trust challenge was still working through the courts, which was expected and which Mercer handled, and which no longer felt like an emergency, because the relinquishment had been filed and the clause was gone, and the eastern parcel stood with its 14 families on it, going about the business of living. Eleanor sat in the estate office on a morning in July. Warm, the windows open, the sound of the property through them, hay and horses and work. And she looked at the account books on the shelf and the new ledger open on the desk, and her own handwriting filling it, clear and systematic, and the life built around her, like a structure she had built herself from materials she had found in a place she hadn't expected to find them. She heard Nathaniel's boots on the stairs. He came in without knocking, which was his method now. They had crossed into the kind of marriage where knocking felt like a formality they had outgrown. He looked at her and at the ledger and said, The Henderson boy fell out of a tree. Is he hurt? Pride mostly. Left wrist. He came to the desk and leaned against it beside her, looking at the ledger. Mercer wrote. What did he say? He says the court has scheduled the trust challenge hearing for September. He's confident. He said confident? He said favorable position, which for Mercer is the equivalent. She nodded. They were quiet for a moment. The comfortable quiet that was one of the things she valued most about what they had built, because it required trust to be quiet with another person and mean nothing by it except the fact of being there. Nathaniel, she said. I want to tell you something. He looked at her. In June last year, she said, I burned my father's letter, the one that said our marriage was necessary. I burned it because I didn't want to look at it anymore. She paused. I have not thought about it since October. He was still. I forgot about it, she said. Not the circumstances. Those I know. I remember everything. But the feeling of it. The feeling of being a solution to someone else's problem, of having no room to be what I actually was. She looked at the account books on the shelf. I forgot what that felt like because this does not feel like that. This has not felt like that in a very long time. He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said. You don't have to say anything, she said. I just wanted you to know. I do want to say something, he said. I want to say that the letter you sent me, your first letter in June, was the most honest thing I had read in years. And I thought, this person is real. And I have spent every day since then being continuously right about that. She looked at him. I am also right, he said quietly, about the fact that you are the most capable, most principled, most genuinely good person I have encountered in my life. And I want our child to know that about their mother, not from me telling them, from watching. She looked at the ledger on the desk. She looked at the books on the shelf. She looked at the account of what they had built, line by line, documented and clean. They'll watch, she said. There's plenty to see. He put his hand on her shoulder. Steady, warm. The hand of a man who had learned how to hold the things he cared for without gripping. And she reached up and covered it with her own. Outside the window, Harrington Manor went about its summer. Workers in the fields. Mrs. Baines in the kitchen. Patients carrying something across the yard. The Henderson boy with his wounded pride and his intact wrist somewhere on the property, learning that trees did not negotiate. 41 children in a schoolroom in Louisville, learning to read the world they had been given and to demand more of it. 14 families on the eastern land, going about the extraordinary ordinary business of living lives nobody had tried to take from them. And in the estate office, in the account books on the shelf, every act of quiet decency documented now, named and numbered, and given its proper weight, not hidden, not performed, just true. The full record of what Nathaniel Harrington had been all along, and what Eleanor Whitfield had arrived to understand and protect and build upon. The world had told her she was being handed to a cold man in a cold house to pay a debt she did not make. The world had been wrong, not about the debt. The debt was real, and debts were real things that required real solutions. But about the cold, about the house. About what was waiting at the end of a carriage ride on a hot June morning when a woman with a pen and a ledger and more spine than anyone had bothered to look for walked into a place that did not know yet that it had been waiting for her. She had come to survive. She had stayed to build, and what she had built, with her own hands, her own mind, her own stubborn refusal to be anything less than exactly what she was a life that held, and a home that was real, and a love that had been earned in the only way that love worth keeping was ever earned, not through feeling alone, but through the daily, deliberate, irreversible choice to show up and be honest and stay. That was what they had. That was what no clause, no investor, no cold man's reputation, no father's debt, no society's whisper, no Webb or Montgomery or accumulated year of difficulty had been able to take from them. And it was theirs, completely, permanently, without condition, theirs.